Crikey. Okay, so I came to a Leeds Dev conference about 5 years ago, and it really helped me define what I wanted to be doing with my career. And they say you should always try and give something back. So, hey, 5 years later, on stage, and I've got 25 minutes to talk to you about documentation. Yeah. So this is about sharing experiences. I thought I'd share my experiences, my progression, my thinking, my motivations, that kind of thing. And it kind of started with this question that I got asked several times by independent people, independently. What do you do all day? And depending on how familiar I am with them and how much of a sense of humour that they've got, it's like, my answer is I write documentation and I have meetings. And, you know, it's self-deprecating, but it's reasonably accurate. I like writing code, I like solving problems, but most of the deep thinking time I have, the output of that is documentation. But I do that because it's effective, it's impactful, it influences people, and it scales well. That's the theory. And my kind of career has been like a search for impact, really, when I look back on it. I started out as a software engineer, or what do we call them, developer, just generic developer at that time. And I was writing code, and I was down in this left-hand corner on one team writing code, and the code you write obviously has an impact, but and that feedback cycle for that is immediate. But if you want to have more of an impact, you start going into this tech lead role or the engineering manager role, that kind of thing, and guiding the vision for that team. And then your question from there is, well, how do I have more impact? Like, I'm addicted to this, so let's go more. And we work with more teams, and that's kind of where the staff engineer role seems to be at our organisation. That's what I'm going for. So that's me. That's my career path so far. And when I came into this role, I was working with multiple teams. I was looking around, I got familiar with everything, and I looked around and I said, well, what's the best thing that I could do to have an impact? And I looked at the tech solutions and kind of came up with an idea. I realized that what we have in our organization, the business thinks we've got one thing, and they think it can do one thing, but actually, I realised that the tech capability that we had didn't match the business vision, and no one was kind of, it works today, but no one's thinking about the future, and no one's realising that there's maybe a little bit of a problem, and we need to steer away from that. So this is great. This is staff engineer stuff. So I thought, right, let's work on fixing that. In this case, it was let's ditch React, maybe. Like, and you can imagine trying to pitch that to everyone. I've been spoilt in the past. I've been, as a tech lead, I've been working with a team for a long time. We're highly aligned. I say the technical direction is this, and we've had enough conversations, enough context, enough one-to-ones and general round-the-room discussions, so everyone kind of goes, yeah, that is the direction we should go in. But then I come into the staff engineer role, and I come in with this, let's go this way, and everyone goes, not quite. No, we all have different concerns, we have different code bases we're working, we have different angles, basically. Everyone's smart, everyone knows what they're talking about, everyone's knowledgeable. They're all kind of right, but they're all kind of wrong. And it's worse than that, because the audience is actually this size now for the staff engineer. It's not just a couple of teams, it's 100 people. The structure, this is kind of our organisation. Structure doesn't matter, scale matters. But every one of these people has an opinion, and I've got to kind of convince every one of these people of my opinion. So yeah, this is the challenge. This is setting up future tech direction for everything. And all of my existing strategies so far have been these one-to-ones, close feedback cycle kind of conversations, and it's not going to scale to that. Oh, here's me. So I sat down and I thought, well, what challenges am I facing? First off, I've got this responsibility now to take more people on board and with my ideas and bring them on board, take them and get a unified vision from them all. All my strategies thus far have been conversations, which quickly caps out because you can't talk to that many people. If you try to do it, your diary is just going to be non-stop meetings and no time for actually doing things. And I looked at the stuff that we had in our organisation, things that people tried before, and I realised I can't be the only person responsible for this, because as soon as I stop pushing it, it'll die. There are so many efforts that have happened, and as soon as the lead person on it stops pushing it, moves on, gets a different role, changes their focus, the whole thing goes. So I can't be the only person responsible for this, because it'll die. It needs to last beyond me. It needs to last without me. So I need to find a way of giving it that longevity. And I did a lot of studying, as you do. You go and read blog posts, you go and read books, you go and try and self-help. And I realised that kind of staff engineering role is influencing. We're in that guiding vision kind of role. We don't do the work, but we influence other people. We plant the seeds of ideas with them, and we just let them grow. It's all deliberate, yeah, but we're not the ones writing the code and pushing this. So in answer to this original question, what I maybe should start saying is, hey, I'm an influencer. It's not just for social media. This is my job to change the direction, to make sure we're doing the right thing without actually doing it for everyone else. So how do you be better at how do you effectively influence people? So there's a few qualities that go along with that. Trustworthiness is important. Consistency of message is important. Coherency is important. You can't go and have 12 different conversations, give 12 different messages to people. It has to be the same thing to get everyone on board. You've got to be available to consult with. You've got to show your workings. You've got to convince people, and you can't just do that by telling people. They have to know. They have to internalise why. So you've got to be there. You've got to be accessible. You've got to be transparent about why you're doing these things, and you've got to be constant. You've got to continually nudge people. You can't just say something like, let's ditch a whole framework that all our stuff is built in, and just have people do it because you say you do it. You just got to gradually steer them on that direction. So you've got to make your persuasive case. You've got to influence people. And you've got to do it at this scale. So scaling your influence is just like scaling any other system. When we talk about scaling systems, we talk about reliability, uptime, those kind of things. In this case, the bottleneck is you. It's like you trying to talk to all these people. But you, as a system, you've got all these uptime challenges, shall we say. You eat, you sleep, you go on holiday, you don't have the connections you need, you get missed from meetings. If you're anything like me, you forget your talking points when you're under pressure, and you don't give the right message, and you don't consistently or coherently explain your ideas. You don't pitch them effectively for your audience. These are all the challenges we face, but this is being human. What's the solution to being human? AI? No. Maybe it's AI. Maybe we can train AI in the future to give decent answers based off stuff, but we still need a source of truth. Documentation is my revelation. Obviously, I've given that away with the talk title. But documentation, simply put, documentation solves everything. All these challenges I'm facing. Documentation can mean many things, many forms, many purposes. Text is the obvious one when people think of it, but it's any sort of knowledge transfer that doesn't have a human actively in the loop. It can be YouTube videos, it can be PowerPoint slides that you can share, it can be a talk that you get recorded and then you share it with people. It's all a form of documentation, it's all a reference point, it's all an artifact that you're creating. So just to reiterate that, why documentation? How does it help? It replays flawlessly. It's repeatable. Every time you play it back, you send the same message. This is good. I don't have to worry about forgetting my talking points. When you replay it, it costs you nothing. You've invested the effort up front in building it, and then you can share it. It's always available, assuming your systems are always available. It's available at 2 a.m. on a Sunday. It's available over Christmas holidays. It's available in 4 years' time. It'll stick around forever, hopefully. And and it's scrutable, as in you can study it. You can study it at your leisure in as much detail. You can replay it, repeat it, try and extract all the pertinent information, which you can't kind of do if you're relying on someone in a meeting. You can't just kind of have someone on hand to answer your questions, but you can have documentation to answer your questions at all point. And for me, reflecting in our business, we are documentation heavy. We do things via processes and procedures, and we write documentations, and we do key decision records and that kind of stuff. And so one more bit of documentation is not going to hurt. It's familiar to us, so I'm not introducing a new paradigm, right? But basically that boils down to the original question, why documentation? Because it alleviates the burden of me having to repeat myself. And it's not that I stop talking about these things, it's that I stop repeating myself, and I can focus on nuances and different angles and going beyond the documentation, leaving these artifacts behind me and moving on to new things. So I tried to figure out what it was about documentation that made it good or bad. So what's good documentation? It's easy to write bad stuff. What's good stuff? There's a few traits, just to put them all on screen. The traits of effective documentation are kind of like your SEO type things for internal people. You want it to be slightly standardized, predictable, findable, searchable. You want people to organically discover this stuff. We have enough buzzwords and technology names. Don't create new ones. Talk about the meaning of things. Use the simplest language possible to describe something. Add a structure. I skim read stuff, so I expect structures to help me find stuff. So I write documentation for that audience. And documentation, assuming it's a big library of docs that people can just search and find, you've got to give context and you've got to give reference and find, like, here are the good things. If you have all of these traits in the documentation you write, that's good. That tells me you've thought about the consumer of the documentation rather than just writing stuff because you want to write stuff. But, you know, what's the purpose of documentation is the next thing. I figure if it's a considerable investment of effort, this is probably why people don't do it, but don't do it so much, of course. It's a lot of effort to write documentation, and it's not as fun as writing code. But I want to get maximum impact from that writing documentation. So if I know what the purpose of the thing I'm writing is, then I'll be more effective at it, and I can put structures in place and write guidelines and put guardrails and framing tools in it to help me more easily write documentation. So there's four main things I want to touch on, which is kind of where I landed in my head for the purpose. First of these is shaping the future. This is the old fun, future-oriented stuff. We want to take all the disparate opinions and achieve alignment. And it's about taking people on a journey and converting them, because doing that, you get the best buy-in, the most constructive challenges, the most fervent supporters by taking people on that same process. If I'm doing this kind of documentation, as we were for writing our engineering guidelines, as for saying, like, let's get rid of React, it's like, what's the motivation? Lay out a common understanding, an angle for it, talk about the decision you made, like ditch React, and then you reason about it. You say why you want to do it. You give all the different points to that. And if there's something, if you're not quite sure of it, you can add clauses, you can add things that would verify or invalidate these decisions. These are all things you do when you're making your argument in face-to-face, in persuasive kind of discussions, but you do it in documentation. That's the trick. The process battle tests your ideas, and then you write it down, and then you share it, and you go through the feedback cycle through docs. But the thing is, if you know why you're writing something, if you know your intent when you're writing it, you get better at it. So the other thing, the obvious thing, crystallizing the present, talking about today. It's not just the future stuff. You've got to know what everything looks like today with common understandings. Language is hard, right? Understanding is hard. Grasping a concept on the first pass is hard. So nothing should be unwritten or implicit. And few people have got full knowledge, understanding, context of code, systems, processes, those kind of things. So this is about crystallising the present, is writing it down, bringing it all together, and precisely and accurately capturing the state of today, so that you've got the common understanding, so that you can say chart your path for the future. You've got to know where you are today. That's influential. Just being the person that writes that down is influential, which leads into, you create documentation to establish your trust and your credibility, to be able to be effective. You've got to show that you know what you're doing. Documentation is a form of a proof of work, or the extensiveness of your thought process. So you outputting the correct amount of documentation, the right stuff, establishes that trust. Here's the docs. It's got your name on it, right? Assuming you have that attribution. Because you created it, you shared it, it becomes part of your presence, part of your persona, lends credibility to you to be able to make the changes and say, like, this is not just some random ephemeral talking head saying we should do this. It's like, here's me building my influence, saying this is a direction we should go in, and this is why. Why documentation? So everyone knows my name, so everyone knows who I am. My name's literally on everything I write. It's publicity. There's no such thing as bad publicity, they say. There probably is, but hey. The job is getting the technical direction shift done, and that requires the credibility, so we build the credibility, so we invest in it. And finally, for this, collaboration and connections. Documentation is a starting point. Documentation alone on its own is not enough. It's not build it and they will come thing. You've got to write it down. You've got to form your thoughts. It's easy to spend time writing stuff, doing it and go, right, job done. But documentation is the starting point for things. It's a point of collaboration. It's the raw material. And then you've got to leverage it. You've got to get buy-in. You've got to make the changes happen. But that stuff is so much easier to have those conversations if you have written it down. If you've got a starting point, if people go into a meeting with nothing to start from, the conversation just meanders off in the wrong direction. But this keeps them on that path. So that's the key purposes I identified for documentation. I keep it in mind before I write anything, and then it frames what I write and how I use it. And I'm not going to talk about any more specifics, but what I want to do is talk about the things that went wrong and the things that went kind of right, and cover that. So challenges and traps, the stuff that went wrong. Obviously, having no credibility, no authority, too much bias in the thing you write, no structure, those kind of, if you don't have that, it's hard to read, things don't work. But the things that I've found that really affect documentation are lost context and unforgiving transparency, which is to say, I've written with assumptions on a shared system in the open. I like being open and transparent, but when I started out, I didn't put context on it, so I wrote a half-baked draft and just published it, and someone read it and went, what the hell? Or I've written stuff with too much opinion, too much bias, and people have disagreed. I've upset people. I've confused people. If you don't give people enough context on documentation, like assume they just land straight into this, assume they've just been shared a link, like give them the context to understand how well formed this is, how new it is, how much it's been reviewed, how much bias is in this thing. Why are you writing the documentation? Next up, time sensitivity. It's very tempting to write documentation as you speak and in the moment, but when you write it, it's permanent. It stays in that form forever, and it's frozen in time. So if you write something that says, "Hey, in the last 2 weeks we've been working on," or in the next 3 months we're going to work on this, like that loses its kind of impact in 3 years' time, or 3 months' time. The time frames, be specific about them. Put specific days, put specific time frames on things. There are lots of examples of docs within our systems that have been written as this is the authoritative thing, and it hasn't been touched for 4 years. And you look at it and go, is this true still? Which leads on to this, upkeep and maintenance. Once you write it, you're then responsible for maintaining it, keeping it up to date. Don't forget that. It's not fire it off and forget it. You need to keep it up to date. Otherwise, it ages fairly fast. And worst of all, if nobody reads it, why are you even bothering writing documentation? People have to read it, so you have to find ways of making them read it and contributing. And on the flip side then, tips, tricks, lessons learnt. First off, start with a template. A big blank screen is terrifying. You know why you're writing things, you know you've got a purpose, you can build to that. So have a template that you start from that's like, my motivations, like, it's just titles. It's like the context is this, the motivation is this, the decision is this. Start with something at least, build it up over time, personalize it, but start with a common structure. You don't have to do this alone. You shouldn't do this alone. Work with a working group or some other cross-cutting group of people to share the ownership, share the burden of responsibility for writing, for reviewing, for dealing with comments, for sharing it, basically. It gives you another persona you can act as well. It's not just James says that we should do this. It can be the front-end architecture working group says that we should do this. You can borrow credibility. You can put on another hat and pretend you're someone entirely different. Asynchronous and synchronous processes are complementary. You write documentation for the basis of a discussion, or you have a meeting with no structure, and then you capture the output of that as a documentation. Like, it's a cycle that feeds itself, so don't just do one or the other. To counter the whole nobody reads it, share it all the time with everyone. Find any excuse, like it can be pull requests, review checklists. Have you read this document? It could be Slack channels. Have you read this document? We've just updated this. Have you read this document? Put it in onboarding documents. You know, if you're going to write it, make absolute best use of it. Don't be perfect as well. They say the best way to get the right answer to something is to write down the wrong answer and post it. Like, post something wrong on the internet and people will correct you. So don't do that, because that will just like undermine your credibility. But start with as much as you know and get people on board to collaborate to fill in the details. And lastly, on this, your audiences will change over time. You might write something for your team now, but they'll share it with another team in a week or two. Fast forward a month, it'll be in front of the CTO reading that, or it'll be the new hire coming into the team as part of their onboarding is reading this document. So there are different audiences from what you currently have, so be kind of considerate of all of them. That's the stuff I've learned. So to just recap, to summarize this a bit, so as a staff engineer, you've got to find a way of being more influential and having more of an impact than just being awesome at code. You scale your influence by recording things and sharing them. It could be presentations, it could be diagrams, whatever fits your organization, whatever fits your audience. Nobody reads documentation for its own sake. You've got to keep it curated and relevant as a reference point, as well as a historic record. It's your responsibility to do this. Documentation, once you create it, it will always be there, so you don't have to be. It frees up your time to work on other things, it takes the pressure off you, and it means you don't have to remember every talking point and reiterate all the complexity of them all of the time, so like leverage them. And people, personalities, biases can be difficult to navigate. You can leverage ownership and personas just as much as anything else. And you can, if you've maybe not got credibility, you can borrow someone else's. And instead of saying, hey, this is James's idea, it can be a collective's idea. And, you know, all being well, documented and recorded stuff persists. But it lasts today when you're in the meeting, but it lasts in a few weeks. It lasts in 3 years when you've moved on to greener pastures. You create it and it's always there. It's outside of your head. It's not. These ideas are no longer reliant on you. I I always like to put a TLDR section at the top of the documents I write so that anyone randomly landing on this can get a feel for what I'm saying. But doing that at the start of the presentation kind of ruins the flow, so I'm sticking it at the end. This is the long-winded way, but yeah, as an individual, you can't reach those larger audiences and change their minds without a strategy to replace face-to-face interactions. And you can do this by writing or curating documentation. It can enhance your communication, give it more longevity, more consistency, and make it more readily available than you. Or the proper TLDR is that there are like oral and written histories, they say. So taking the extra time to create the written history gives you many benefits, especially that once you've created it, it continually repays you in the form of influence. Even when you're not actively pushing these things, it will be there and it will be constantly enhancing your credibility. And that's time. Woo, it's done.